Now you have an opportunity to interact with us, and I think we have a lot of mic holders around, and if you could find one right here on the front. Please introduce yourself and direct the question to anybody.
Well, I really enjoyed the discussions. I am a retired bureaucrat from Bangladesh. The presentation by Maxim Terrero was very good, but it was, generalized, I must say, and academic partly. What Alberto Valdez said partly touched the real problem, though he did not mention it. I mean the political economy aspect of these markets, trade and macro policies. This is very, very important. I like to give an example from South Asia, let's say Bangladesh and India, because these issues are country specific. You cannot generalize them. Now let's say, take the case of Bangladesh. In the first half of the 90s, and also in the first half of the new millennium, the parties that were in power, they believed in self-reliance, not in self-sufficiency in the matter of food. Well, we have other resources, we will import if necessary, and import by the public sector. That was the philosophy of those two governments, and what happened? In the period, those two periods, the agricultural growth rate in Bangladesh dropped dramatically. And then came this, the new government of the second half of the 90s, when Bangladesh had a very severe floods. And IFPRI was helping Bangladesh with some policy advice, and the government permitted the private sector to import food rather than relying only on the public sector for the public food distribution system or for social safety network. But this worked very, very well. But then we come to 2007 and 2008. I think we have to differentiate here between cereals, non-cereal agriculture, fruits and vegetables, and also non-crop agriculture like poultry, fisheries, livestock. We have to distinguish between these two. We are mainly concerned, the political economy aspect is concerned mainly with cereals. And we found in the context of the 2007 and 8 situation, world food crisis, that only 7% of the world's total rice production is international traded. Bangladesh tried to import rice from other rice surplus countries. We could not get any rice. We got a promise from India to give us 500,000 tons of rice, but it took us 4 years to get the delivery. So these are what I want to say, that there are two aspects we must not forget while we discuss markets, trade and macro policies. These are country specific, there are country specific issues, and there are political economy aspects. Nothing has happened in the Doha round, and India got away with this Food Safety Act at the Bali conference.
Thank you for your comment. We'll have our panelists respond. We'll take a couple more questions and comments before I'll have the panelists respond. Right there, back there.
Yeah, thank you. I'm John Coonrod with the Hunger Project. And I have a question for Ms. Jackson regarding the G33 proposal on public stockholding in terms of that's, I guess, due to be sorted at the WTO by the Nairobi meeting in December. There has been blocks to negotiating that, and I know a lot of NGOs have urged the US government to negotiate in good faith on this policy that would have a great deal to do with policies in terms of safety nets. So I'd love to hear what the chances of that are.
Thank you. The friend, right here. Okay.
Yeah, I could not finish, Julia. I just wanted to say that on the basis of self-sufficiency, not self-reliance.
Okay.
The Bangladesh government presently is making a lot of investment in research and development. There's an endowment fund for agricultural research. And our local agricultural research institutes, whether it is Bangladesh Agricultural Research Institute or Bangladesh Rice Research Institute, along with support from the policymakers, the institution, IRI and IFPRI, but government's own decision to subsidize the farmers so that there is a minimum price for the producer and a maximum price for the consumer. These issues are very much part of political economy, and these are the issues which the Bangladesh government is taking note of.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comment. And one more comment, then we'll have the panelists respond.
Yeah, David Orden from IFPRI and Virginia Tech. You know, we're going into December with two major international conferences about to take place. The the climate change conference, I think, is going to receive a lot of attention. I think people are hoping maybe this is a start of something more constructive on climate change. But in the Doha, within the same 3-week period, the WTO will have a ministerial meeting. And actually, the US, the Europeans, and the Japanese are arguing that the Doha round should be officially declared terminated. And without much accomplishment compared to any of the visions, not even elimination, for example, of export subsidies, which everyone thought after the Uruguay round, the next round will surely bring an elimination of export subsidies. So I'd like to ask anyone on the panel to comment on this curious, from an economist's point of view, free trade is a resource-saving kind of set of policies and should be, therefore, in a sense, beneficial for the environment where you're trying to do more with less resources. So the panel could comment on why there's this dichotomy between moving forward on trade agreement versus moving forward on climate change, and secondly, what IFPRI's agenda might be in trying to bring those into a cohesive framework.
We can take 1 or 2 more comments. Right there, from the front.
Thank you very much. I'm Necton Mahura, ambassador for Malawi. I will ask a rather unfair question to Leanne. What is your expectation as to the outcome of the WTO ministerial meeting in December, especially with regard to agriculture? Again, focusing on small countries in view of the developments that the previous speaker spoke about, so that we, as small countries, should be ready for the outcome. I would like you to mention something about it in view of your vantage point from WTO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We probably have opportunity for 1 more comment or question from the audience before I turn to the panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, and happy anniversary, IFPRI. I'm very happy to be in front of the very erudite panelists here. My question is very basic in a way. We all want a well-functioning market, a well-connected, well-functioning market. That's the bottom line. All this effort is including trade. So what we are doing with respect to things which has changed, there's a sea change in global trade thing, in the way that the global value chain has come up, how we are including the small farmers, smallholder farmers, is an issue, because are they benefiting from this global value chain that is in the working? So where we are and how we can do a more inclusive, beneficial, smallholder farmer oriented global trade and value chain.
Thank you.
From the
Yeah, thank you. I think that's about the time we have for taking comments from you. Now I return to the panelists and give them an opportunity to respond, as well as any closing remarks that they have. So we're going to combine those 2. So let me invite Leanne, who had lots of questions, to go first.
Okay, maybe I'll focus on 2. So the G33 proposal, which is a proposal that deals with public stockholding for food security purposes, it was initially negotiated in the Bali ministerial 2 years ago, and then a year ago we had a kind of clarifying decision that the General Council at the WTO made, that members would make an effort to find a permanent solution. So what we decided in Bali was sort of a peace clause against certain types of disputes to be taken against stockholding. What they decided a year ago was to work towards a permanent solution in Nairobi. So just to say that the negotiating machine is working on trying to get towards a permanent solution. And maybe just to clarify for people in the audience who haven't had the pleasure of getting into that proposal in detail, the Agreement on Agriculture has provisions that say that public stockholding fall under a category of measures that are non-trade distorting, but there's a footnote on that in our rules which says that if price support is part of the public stockholding policy, then members have to declare the use of that price support. So at the time of the negotiations in the Uruguay round, that was the price support component was carved out. So there are plenty of public stockholding programs that fall completely in the green box and don't have any limits on spending to achieve that. But if they include a price support component, then there are separate rules and there are limits on what the spending can be. So this is the question. The question is, having those limits, the G33 would like, is concerned that in the current economic situation with the way prices are moving, that limits are constraining. So that's my crib sheet on the G33 proposal. So just to say, there have been ongoing consultations on that issue, and I know that they're ongoing, but the outcome in Nairobi is not guaranteed. So the consultations continue. And then there was a question on what can we hope for in Nairobi. So like I said, we're a member-driven organization, so it's contingent on everybody coming to Nairobi looking for outcomes. And it's true that recently the language that's been used has been a limited package, a smaller package. So it's not that Nairobi will be the conclusion of the Doha round, but there are some bits of issues that will be included in Nairobi, including some outcomes for LDCs, which are positive, some outcomes probably on cotton and transparency provisions, and then the question on export subsidies is still an open discussion. It's clearly something that many members would like to see as an outcome, but it's not clear at this point.
Thank you, Leanne.
Oh, can I just say in conclusion, because I'll take 30 seconds to say, one of the things that I think is interesting and maybe picks up on the question you posed to me about how to convince policymakers that it's important, one of the things I think is to create dialogues across ministries, because the more siloed the agricultural ministry is from the trade ministry, the more difficult it is to actually get kind of a coherent policy that links trade and agriculture. So that's
Thank you. Peter, take it away.
Okay, thanks. Two quick points. The speaker from Bangladesh points out that these food security issues, policy issues, are country-specific. But in fact, I would argue that there's a lot of commonality around some of the key problems. And one is this fetishism on food self-sufficiency. Why is it so common that we see that as the approach of countries to solving their problems of food security, when in many circumstances food self-sufficiency is antithetical to food security and getting food to the poor? I look at Indonesia now. They've got probably 3 million people below the poverty line who are suffering from hunger because they've got very, very high rice prices on behalf of trying to reach self-sufficiency. Won't allow imports in, even though they really need it in an El Nino year. I think the research agenda here, though, needs to really understand the political economy of that behavior. It is so common that there must be some common factors. And I think getting into some of the behavioral dimensions of this, why do producers, why do consumers so much prefer a stable food environment to an unstable food environment? And then why do they hold governments responsible and throw them out when they don't provide that? So if we could get a little deeper understanding of that motivation, it seems to me we could make a lot of progress in having a more efficient approach to trade. We need to figure out ways to build confidence in food trade. And it would be wonderful if the WTO were the mechanism for building that confidence, but it hasn't been for the last couple of decades. And so I think we may have to go to country level mechanisms and help at that level. Quick comment on global value chains. I was just at a workshop in Managua, Nicaragua, that the IAD, our Inter-American Development Bank, sponsored on food security. There's enormous variation in the extent to which smallholders participate in global value chains. In Asia, pretty much because they have to, these value chains are finding ways to work with smallholder farmers. In Latin America, they didn't have to and pretty much wiped them out. So I think there's a lot of interest and learning going on in this process, but it's a very dynamic situation right now. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Ross, you.
I'll just take up the point that was made from the side of the room on the compatibility between environmental conservation of environmental resources and good use of economic resources. I'd strongly support that. Open trade provides a better basis for conservation of the environment than closed trade. And on the more general point you made, I think we have to recognize that the international trading system is in very bad shape, and that the proliferation of preferential areas is discriminating systematically against a lot of lower income countries, and that it's bad for the poor in those countries and others. And I think it should be an important part of IFPRI's agenda going forward. It's an old agenda, but no less important for that, to explain the advantages of genuine, open, multilateral trade.
Thank you, Ross. Maximo?
Thank you. So let me first start with the idea that in any agreement of trade, there will always be winners and losers. It's impossible to believe that we always will win or always lose. The issue and the important thing is to identify who are the winners and who are the losers, and to identify in the side of the losers how we can support them and what type of policies can be done to support them so that they also benefit from alternative mechanisms to be able to move forward. The second point is I completely agree with the comment of Bangladesh of the importance of taking into account the country institutionality, the country political economy, and the specificities of the country. That's essential, and that's basically what we try to do in all our work. This is not theory, this is basically based on the structures that are happening in the countries. Now, the important thing also, as Peter was mentioning, is that self-sufficiency could be extremely problematic for the country. Putting price bans, putting maximum price for the consumer or minimum price for the producer could create significant problems. The only thing we cannot do today is predict prices. So if I am a policymaker and I want to tell which is the price, I am going to fail for sure. We can model volatility, we can predict volatility even, but price levels is impossible. So how we define policies that can solve that problem without creating policies that will create an additional problem to the population? And that's where we need to understand the distributional effects of those policies and how we can move forward within that institutionality. It's completely true, and I was in Bangladesh in those days when there was the issue of rice and the lack of capacity to import, and that was a real problem of access. And the G20 in that time was trying to resolve that by allowing food to move across borders for humanitarian reasons. And at the end, what was approved in the G20 was not approved in the WTO. And only WFP was the one able to do that. So we need to enforce and we need to improve the mechanisms to minimize those problems. But clearly, the linkages between flow of goods and access of goods is essential, and especially the efficiency of the goods, especially if we're going to look at the dichotomy that David Orden was mentioning in terms of climate change. We need to be as effective as possible in where we produce, but we also need to assure at the same time that the goods will flow in the proper way so that we don't have to rely on these protectionist policies that at the end could affect our own realities. And let me just finish with the issue of two additional points. One, global value chains, as was mentioned by Peter, a few years ago was referred as something bad, that only the big will be the winners. Clearly, it's not the case. If you go to South Vietnam and look at Dalat and see how smallholders are basically complying with all the standards and exporting and being part of the global value chain, you see that it is possible. So the issue is how we can create and reduce market failures for those smallholders to link into that value chain. So we call it inclusive global value chains, so that we can find ways and mechanisms through the market. And it could be at the beginning we need to impose some subsidies. But the important thing is to understand that those subsidies will have to fade out at some point, and the mechanisms to make that to be a reality. And finally, on the Nairobi meeting, the more evidence can be brought there, I think the better it can be. But again, it's so complex at this point because they are not focusing on specific points. They are focusing in the broad definition of food security. And that is, I think, making more difficult a potential agreement, even in small issues. And with what is happening in the world with the big block trade agreements, also makes more complicated the possibility of getting into this type of an agreement.
Thank you, Maximo. Alberto, you get your final minute.
Thank you for closing comments. I would like to highlight three topics very, very briefly. One, is there still a bias against agriculture? Much less than what it was 20 years ago. Is there an anti-export bias for agriculture? Yes, and quite severe. In a number of countries, we have done recent work on South Asia, for example, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, you know, the treatment of import competing products versus vis-a-vis export products, you know, is totally different. So you have within agriculture strong forces to move out in relative terms from exports, see, which is a very large sector with a tremendous potential. So I think here you have a source of growth which is being taxed. Second, from a trade perspective, I would have thought that the issue of the free trade agreements, the mega blocks emerging now, etc., this is a very critical topic for a number of developing countries. One is WTO, and it's wonderful it exists, etc., but Doha, we know, has not been very, very fast. But we do have powerful forces moving, you know, and we have, of course, we know more about the EU-US, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the ASEAN-China, you know, imagine, you know, what's likely to happen there. And then you have many others, you know. So I think this area is one which is, IFPRI could, I think, contribute a lot in terms of what are the options for country X or Y, you know. You stay out, do you join, you know, the cost benefit. And finally, when we do this fairly detailed work on incentives, you know, we have to look at the comparison, say, between farm gates and border prices, you know. I'm struck still by the very high markets margins, you know. That seems to be, must be a huge distortion, you know, underinvestment of public resources in roads, soft and hard infrastructure, you know. There was an analysis by the World Bank, Charlie Nash, you know, which looked at the logistic infrastructure, and they concluded that sort of this Latin America was losing about 1/3 of this value of trade, you know, due to this excessive cost, you know, in transportation.
Thank you, Alberto. Let me close with my thoughts here as I heard all these panelists. As you know, the US government has been a leader and has been committed to global food security for decades. And we've been assisting a lot of vulnerable populations throughout the planet. In our own report at USDA, we do an international food security assessment, and we do that. And in our recent analysis, we found out that the goals that we set in 1995 at the World Food Summit about reducing the number of undernourished people to half by 2015 has been met in many of these developing countries in Latin America and Asia. But Sub-Saharan Africa has been the one that's been left behind all along. Okay? So markets, trade, and macro policies have helped us towards solving the problem of food availability, but not necessarily the problem of access, and not necessarily the problem of utilization, the nutrition component of it, as well as the stability, which is the climate change component of it. So we have a long way to go, and the policies that we need to use to get there are going to rely on markets, trade, and macroeconomic environments. So with that, I close and thank these excellent speakers here for having given us a lively discussion. Thank you.